For most of my life, I have been surrounded by people who assumed intelligence and wealth naturally travel together. It is an elegant belief. It is also one of the most misleading beliefs in modern life. People look at the bright child in the classroom, the student with the best memory, the young analyst who can explain complex systems better than everyone else, the engineer who sees what others miss, the academic who can cut an argument to pieces, and they assume the future belongs to that person. Sometimes it does, very often it does not. That is the uncomfortable truth. I have watched brilliant people spend 20 years becoming more precise, more informed, more technically capable, and more respected, only to wake up one day with very little real wealth relative to their effort. And I have watched people who seem much less impressive in classrooms quietly build businesses, acquire assets, develop networks, and end up owning a life the brilliant person only analyzed. That is not because intelligence is worthless. It is because intelligence and wealth are not the same game. If you confuse them, you can spend a very long time winning the wrong contest. That is what I want to talk about. Not in the shallow way people usually do, where they say smart people overthink and average people take action. That is partly true, but it is far too thin. The real issue is deeper. Smart people are often trained to use their intelligence in ways institutions reward. Wealth is often built by using intelligence in ways institutions do not automatically reward and sometimes quietly discourage. That distinction changes everything. From childhood, society has a very clear definition of what smart looks like. Smart means you absorb information quickly. You perform well under evaluation. You recognize patterns. You solve abstract problems. You answer correctly inside constraints other people created. You do not just know things. You know how to know things in a way authority can measure. That is why schools love smart children. Smart children make institutions look successful. They sit still. They learn fast. They produce visible outcomes. They fit the grading system. They become proof that the machine works. There is nothing wrong with that. I admire learning deeply. I admire precision. I admire discipline. But I also know that a classroom is not a balance sheet, and a grading system is not a wealth engine. Schools reward correctness inside a predefined frame. Wealth creation often rewards something else entirely. It rewards ownership, persuasion, timing, risk tolerance, ambiguity management, and the ability to move before certainty arrives. Those are not the same muscles. That is the first thing smart people often miss. They think excellence inside a system naturally prepares them to own part of the system. Very often it prepares them to serve the system exceptionally well. That is a very different outcome. A smart child is praised for being right. A future wealth builder is often paid for being early. A smart child is rewarded for precision. A wealth builder is often rewarded for asymmetry. A smart child learns that authority grades him. A wealth builder learns that authority can be sold to, negotiated with, bypassed, hired, or ignored. Those are different educations. The tragedy is that the bright child often becomes attached to the wrong rewards. He learns to love correctness. He learns to fear visible mistakes. He learns that his identity comes from being the person who sees the flaw, catches the inconsistency, and produces the most refined answer. That identity can be very useful in professional life. It can also become financially expensive because wealth in the real world often accumulates to people who are willing to act while the model is still incomplete. I have seen this so many times that it no longer surprises me. The smart person studies the market, compares 12 scenarios, reads the footnotes, notices every hidden risk, builds a better framework, and still does not move. The average person who cannot see all 12 failure paths in high resolution buys a small building, starts the service business, opens the second location, hires the first salesperson, and gradually builds equity while the smarter observer keeps perfecting the memo. This does not mean ignorance is superior. It means wealth rewards movement under uncertainty more than institutional life does. That is a hard lesson for intelligent people, because institutions train them to wait for complete understanding before committing markets, do not pay a premium for beautifully delayed confidence. They often pay the person who can tolerate imperfect information and still take a sensible shot. I want to say this carefully. The smart person is not wrong about the risks. The risks are real. The problem is not his intelligence. The problem is how his intelligence has been disciplined. He has been trained to use intelligence in the service of avoiding error rather than accumulating asymmetry. That is a profound difference. A person who is excellent at seeing downside becomes cautious. A person who is cautious becomes employable. A person who is employable becomes stable. A person who is stable becomes respectable. A person who is respectable begins collecting rewards that are real enough to keep him in place, but often too linear to make him rich. That is the trap. The system loves intelligent people because intelligent people can optimize large machines they do not own. They make organizations faster, cleaner, more efficient, more profitable, more rational. They increase output. They reduce mistakes. They strengthen process. In return, the system gives them salary, title, prestige, and the comforting sense that they are valuable. They are valuable. The question is to whom? That is the sentence I wish more intelligent people would ask themselves much earlier in life. Is my intelligence compounding for me, or is it compounding for something I do not own? Once you ask that, honestly, the whole picture changes. Most smart people stay poor, or at least financially ordinary, not because they lack talent, but because their talent was directed toward institutional usefulness rather than ownership. They became indispensable cogs instead of equity accumulators. That is why good grades do not guarantee wealth. Good grades usually predict a person who can do very well inside structured systems. Wealth often comes from building or owning systems, not from performing beautifully within them. There is another problem, and it is psychological. When you are labeled smart early, you often build your self-worth around being accurate. You do not just like getting things right. You need to be the person who gets things right. That makes ambiguity painful. It makes premature action feel humiliating. It makes public failure feel like evidence against your identity. So you wait, you polish, you prepare more, you tell yourself you are being prudent. Sometimes you are. Often you are simply protecting your ego at a very high financial cost. Average people can have an advantage here precisely because they do not have as much identity tied up in being correct. They can look foolish more easily. They can start with a bad product. They can make a clumsy sales pitch. They can launch version 1.0 and let the market embarrass them into version 2.0. They do not love humiliation, but they are less existentially threatened by it. That matters. Markets are not grading rubrics. A classroom punishes wrong answers. A market often rewards repeated, imperfect attempts that converge on something useful. This is why I think the phrase smart people stay poor can sound insulting if you hear it badly, but it becomes clarifying if you hear it properly. It does not mean intelligence is the problem. It means intelligence aimed at accuracy, validation, and system optimization is often a poor substitute for intelligence aimed at ownership, leverage, and strategic position. That is the real divide. There is also the employment trap. Smart people are very employable. This sounds like a blessing, and in many ways it is. They can get hired, they can solve difficult problems, they can rise within structured environments, they become analysts, consultants, engineers, researchers, lawyers, professionals of every kind. Their value is visible. Institutions like them because institutions run on people who can improve output without threatening ownership. And that is exactly where the trap closes. Employment can give you comfort. It rarely gives you uncapped upside. No matter how clever you are, salary bands exist, budget constraints exist, hierarchies exist. You can double your productivity and get a 5% raise. You can save a company millions and get a larger office. You can become the person everybody relies on and still leave each evening with nothing but cash compensation and praise. Meanwhile, the average owner of a modest business, if he controls something with demand, can make one decision that changes the value of his equity by an amount no salary review committee would ever approve. That is what ownership does. Ownership makes multiplication possible. Employment usually makes increment possible. Intelligent people often accept the trade because the employment world rewards the exact habits they spent years perfecting. The job gives them clear benchmarks, visible status, and a sense of deserved progress. Ownership offers something much less emotionally tidy. It offers ambiguity, volatility, periods of looking foolish, and long stretches where the world may not confirm that you are brilliant. That is intolerable to many highly validated people, so they remain where they are admired. Admiration is pleasant, equity is what compounds. That is another sentence worth sitting with. A lot of intelligent people optimize for admiration and then wonder why average people with less polish end up wealthier. Because admiration and wealth are not the same reward. Society confuses prestige with profitability all the time. The intelligent person often chooses careers that maximize cognitive respect from other intelligent people. Academia, research, high status, professional tracks, specialized technical roles. These can be noble, fascinating, and socially admired. They are not always the best wealth vehicles relative to effort. The average person may enter a less prestigious field with better ownership, economics, logistics, sales, contracting distribution, franchising, real estate, a trade business, boring service companies, unromantic things with recurring cash flow. The smart person gets applause. The average builder gets assets. Over 20 years, those outcomes separate dramatically. I am not telling you to despise intellectual life. I am telling you to stop confusing it with wealth creation. That confusion costs bright people a fortune. Then there is social intelligence. This is another area where analytical people often underrate what actually moves money. Wealth is a human game before it is a spreadsheet game. Deals happen because people trust one another. Capital moves because someone feels confident in the operator. Opportunities appear through conversations, introductions, relationships, and reputation. The isolated intellectual often regards networking as shallow or manipulative. He thinks the strength of the idea should be enough. Sometimes it is. Much more often, access follows trust, and trust follows repeated human contact. Average people who are better at persuasion, confidence projection, and relationship maintenance often unlock opportunities the smarter person never even sees. That does not mean the smarter person lacked value. It means value without distribution is a weaker force than the intelligent person wants to believe. This is one reason salespeople become rich while technically superior people remain salaried. The salesperson can move value. The technician can explain value. Wealth often belongs to the one who can move it. That is not fair in the moral sense. It is simply how markets behave. Perfectionism makes all of this worse. The smart person wants the business model refined, the product polished, the deck correct, the pricing researched, the rollout structured, the downside mapped, the credentials earned, the public position defensible. The average person often launches something cruder much sooner. The market does not care that the smart person's fifth draft was theoretically better. It cares that the other person got there first, learned faster, collected feedback earlier, and built distribution while the perfectionist was still trying to avoid embarrassment. This is not because markets love mediocrity. It is because timing and iteration frequently matter more than internal elegance. That sentence explains a great deal of wealth inequality between smart employees and average owners. There is also overspecialization. Bright people often go deeper and deeper into a narrow band of expertise because that is how institutions distinguish them. Become the expert, become the authority, become the person who knows more than anyone else in the room. There is real value in that, but wealth often flows not to the narrow expert alone, but to the person who can connect multiple worlds. Technology plus sales, finance plus psychology, operations plus storytelling, law plus negotiation, product plus distribution. Breadth makes commerce. Depth earns respect. The market pays more consistently for useful integration than for isolated brilliance. The brilliant specialist may become indispensable to an enterprise. The moderate generalist who owns the enterprise may become rich. That is not a pleasant comparison. It is a very real one. Now we come to something even more subtle. Intelligent people often trust systems more than average people do. Why would they not? Their whole lives have taught them that institutions reward merit. They studied, performed, and were recognized. Their experience tells them that the world, while imperfect, is responsive to excellence. That belief becomes dangerous when it migrates into markets. Markets are not teachers. They are not grading your intellectual purity. They do not care how carefully you reasoned or how much symbolic prestige you accumulated. They care about leverage, timing, distribution, ownership, demand, and luck. The average person who never fully trusted systems may actually approach markets more realistically. He expects opportunity, not justice. He expects asymmetry, not neatness. He is less scandalized by the fact that ugly, boring, or inelegant businesses can produce astonishing wealth. The smart person is often still waiting for the world to reward the cleanest model and the finest argument. The world is usually busier paying for practical position. I have thought a great deal about why some very bright people end up in comfortable cages. The answer, I think, is that intelligence can become an instrument of comfort. It helps them find the safest path through institutions. It helps them maximize salary while minimizing visible error. It helps them justify caution with beautiful language. It helps them remain admired inside stable systems. That is wonderful. If your goal is admiration plus security, it is not the same as wealth. Wealth generally requires a different emotional arrangement. You need enough courage to tolerate ambiguity, enough ego flexibility to look foolish temporarily, enough realism to prioritize ownership over praise, enough sales instinct to move value through humans, and enough strategic detachment to ask whether your intelligence is serving, compounding, or only competence. That is the real question, not are you smart. Where is your smartness pointed? If it is pointed toward refining someone else's machine, you may become indispensable and still not become rich. If it is pointed toward building or acquiring claims on future cash flow, even if you begin with something small, you have changed games. That is everything. The solution is not to become less intelligent. The solution is to redirect intelligence. Study ownership as seriously as you studied school. Study cash flow as seriously as you studied ideas. Study leverage as seriously as you studied correctness. Study persuasion as seriously as you studied logic. Study ambiguity tolerance as seriously as you studied precision. Study timing as seriously as you studied credentials. Intelligence becomes extraordinarily powerful when it is married to ownership and courage. On its own, inside institutions, it often becomes beautifully compensated obedience. I do not say that cruelly. I say it because it is true. If you are smart, you already possess a great deal of what wealth creation requires. Pattern recognition, learning speed, analytical range. The problem is not capacity, it is allocation. Are you allocating your intelligence toward salary optimization or toward equity accumulation, toward being right or toward being positioned, toward prestige or toward multiplication? That is the fork. One path can make you respected, stable, and even comfortable. The other path can make you wealthy. Sometimes the same person gets both. More often, one has to be chosen first. There is one final thing I want to say because I think it matters more than all the rest. Smart people often stay poor because the systems that first rewarded them trained them to love comfort disguised as excellence. They learned to trust the institution, refine the model, perfect the answer, and avoid visible failure. Those are beautiful habits in a school, a lab, a law firm, a consultancy, or a technical team. Wealth creation usually asks for something rougher, a tolerance for looking unfinished, a willingness to own rather than merely improve, a readiness to move before certainty arrives, an appetite for multiplication instead of applause. That is not a moral upgrade. It is a structural shift. And once you understand that, the whole problem becomes much less mysterious. The average person who gets rich is not always luckier or smarter than the brilliant person who stays ordinary. Very often he is simply playing a game more aligned with how wealth actually accumulates. He owns, he sells, he moves, he iterates, he leverages, he tolerates ambiguity, he lets imperfection exist long enough for equity to grow around it. Meanwhile, the intelligent observer keeps perfecting the map. Maps are useful, but they are not territory, and territory is where wealth lives. So if you consider yourself intelligent, ask yourself one question with absolute seriousness. Is your intelligence making you harder to replace inside somebody else's system, or is it helping you build something that compounds for you? That answer will tell you much more about your future than any test score ever did. There is another reason this matters so much, especially for people who have already spent years being rewarded for being the smartest person in the room. The world pays a hidden premium for emotional comfort. That premium is enormous. The intelligent professional often buys comfort in very respectable forms. A prestigious title, a clear hierarchy, a known paycheck, a role where excellence is measurable, a career path where the next step is visible enough that anxiety can be translated into effort. None of this feels like fear. It feels like responsibility. It feels like adulthood. It feels like making the sensible choice. But if that sensible choice keeps your intelligence trapped inside someone else's equity structure year after year, then the premium you paid for emotional comfort may have been most of your future upside. That is a hard sentence. It is also one of the truest things I know about wealth. Many average people who build assets are not less afraid than the bright salaried professional. They are simply willing to look less polished for longer. They can live through a few years of mixed signals, low status, experimental income, awkward business development, or unclear identity while something accumulates beneath the surface. The intelligent professional often finds that phase intolerable because it produces fewer clean signals of competence. No grade, no promotion rubric, no elegant annual review. Just messy reality and slowly compounding equity. Yet messy reality is where wealth so often begins. This is why I think smart people need to ask an even sharper question than the one people usually ask about money. Not just what pays more, but what am I becoming more dependent on with every year I continue down this path? If the answer is approval, salary, title, and institutional belonging, then you may be rising while also narrowing your freedom. If the answer is ownership, network distribution, cash flow, and claims that can outlive your daily labor, then even a slower early path may be carrying you somewhere far richer. That is the deeper divide. The average person who gets rich is often not a mystery. Once you see this clearly, he may have less polish, less academic elegance, less theoretical precision, but he points his life toward multiplication. The smart person often points life toward validation. Validation feels good. Multiplication changes your future. And when the two do not align, wealth usually goes to the one who chose multiplication. That is why the answer to this whole problem is not to reject intelligence. It is to stop spending intelligence only where institutions clap for it, direct it toward claims, direct it toward asymmetry, direct it toward ownership, direct it toward the uncomfortable places where nothing looks impressive yet. But equity is quietly forming. That is how intelligence finally starts working for you, instead of merely making you excellent at helping larger systems become richer.